media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live, this is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today. You know, something happened in a courtroom yesterday that you just won't see very often. Even though the most recent booklet we have is on a biblical view of criminal justice, we recognize that there is always a need for justice, but also grace and mercy and forgiveness. And it related so much to the conversation we had just a few days ago with Ruth Graham, as her book was on the subject of forgiveness. And if you've already seen the video or watched it on television, you know what I'm talking about. I'd love to get your comments, 1-800-351-1212, because it was something that I think was very powerful, very striking, and I'd love to hear your comments about it. If you have not, and it's possible that even though this has been replayed so many different times, has made the national news, it all took place after the sentencing of Amber Guyger, again, the disgraced police officer who was then, first of all, found guilty of murder, making her now a felon, and then she was sentenced to 10 years in prison. And so there had been, at the sentencing trial, an opportunity for the Guyger families to actually testify, and the Jean families to testify. And in the midst of what was already an emotionally packed time, you have this 18-year-old Brant Jean, who actually, before he spoke, had the prosecutor, Jason Hermas, whisper something to him and nodded. And he was obviously speaking very slowly, very deliberately. And again, I'll just try to summarize some of the things he said. He said, I don't want to say twice or for the 100th time what you've or how much you've taken from us. I think you know that. But and then he kind of paused and said, you know, if you truly are sorry, I know I can speak for myself. I forgive you. Now, that's pretty powerful. We've seen this a few times, of course, in the church in South Carolina. We've seen that with the Amish church in Pennsylvania, but we don't see that very often, where an individual who lost a family member, could be a father, a mother, it could be brothers, sisters, whatever, say that. But nevertheless, he said, I forgive you. And he said, I know if you go to God and ask him, he will forgive you as well. I love you just like anyone else. I'm not going to say, I hope you rot and die just like my brother did. I personally want the best for you. And it was such a contrast to what we had had from the Botham Jean family. And that was probably reason enough. And let me just give you the backstory for just a minute. Brant was raised in the Church of Christ in St. Lucia. I've been there before, once on a cruise, so I know a little bit about the family background and what it was like to live there. And interestingly enough, Brant's middle name is Samuel, after the prophet in the Old Testament. And if you're not familiar, Botham Jean's middle name is Shem, which is, of course, the son of Noah. So this is obviously a very biblically oriented family. As a matter of fact, Allison Jean, who's the mother, gave all three of her children biblical middle names. And, of course, I mentioned Botham Jean's is Shem and Brant's is Samuel. And so that is sort of the backstory there as well. But then Brant Jean went on to say, I think giving your life to Christ would be the best thing that Botham would want you to do. And said again, I love you as a person, and I don't want anything bad for you. That was powerful enough. But then what took place next is Brant turns to the judge, and I'm going to talk about what the judge did in just a minute, and said, I don't know if this is possible, but can I give her a hug, please? There was this long pause because the judge had never seen something like that before. He said, please, Well, then District Judge Tammy Kemp said yes. He stepped down from the witness stand, and immediately Amber Geiger walks over, really kind of runs over, and they hug. Again, people that keep track of this, the hug lasted, I guess, for 55 seconds, they said. Said he didn't want her to go to prison, that he forgave her. He, of course, had wiped a tear from his eye even as he come off the witness stand, and you could hear sobs all over the courtroom as the two of them hugged. And another person wiping tears from her eyes was Judge Tammy Kemp. Okay, it gets even more interesting and just again shows the level of forgiveness, because then you have Judge Tammy Kemp coming down and actually speaking to the family, the Botham family, and said a few things. The only thing you could probably hear was at one point, "You understand," so I don't know if they quite understood what was going on there. And so then what you have here is Amber Geiger's family had already been escorted out earlier after the sentence, so they didn't really witness this. And the most significant one is the judge goes back in, gets her Bible, and then comes over to the table where Amber Geiger is sitting and says, "You can have mine. I mean, you can have my Bible. I have 3 or 4 at home." Then she began to counsel Amber Geiger right there at the end of this. They were talking in kind of a low, merrily audible voice, but then she hands her the Bible and said, "This is your job," and then mentions John 3:16, saying that this would strengthen her. Amber Geiger nodded her head, and then the judge said, "You just need a tiny mustard seed of faith, and you start with this." Well, at this point, then, Amber Geiger embraces the judge, and she embraces Amber, and Geiger whispers something to her. I think we can guess what she might have said, because then you heard the judge say, "Ma'am, it's not because I'm good, it's because I believe in Christ. You haven't done so much that you can't be forgiven," the judge told her. "You did something bad in one moment in time. What you do now matters." And so then the judge said that Amber Geiger could take the Bible with her because, as you well know, she's taken out into a holding cell, and then she's going to go to Huntsville. And so Geiger leaves with a 10-year prison sentence, but also with a Bible that was given to her by the judge. Don't know if that's the first time she's heard the gospel, because I do know, and I won't defy any confidences, I do know the pastor that invited Amber Geiger to his church, which is an evangelical church. I suspect she went. Don't know how many times she went. I know if she went to that church, she heard the gospel any time she went on a Sunday, and maybe sat in the back, or maybe went on an off time so that she wouldn't be as easily identifiable. But nevertheless, she certainly heard the gospel yesterday, and she certainly heard John 3:16 yesterday, and she certainly heard about Brant Jean wanting to forgive her and wanting the best for her, and saying that if there's one thing that my brother would want for you, it's to accept Jesus Christ. I'd love to get your comments. Perhaps you've seen the video. Even now, you've probably heard at least the summary of it. And if you'd like to join our conversation, that number is 1-800-351-1212. The issue of forgiveness. When we come back, I might also mention just briefly that there have been a lot of people, a good number of people is probably a better way to say it, that have criticized the judge, who they say is supposed to be objective, and have objected to the fact that she offered forgiveness and offered a Bible and gave a hug to somebody who is now a convicted felon. So I'd love to get your comments. 1-800-351-1212. We'll be right back.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
One of the most powerful critiques of public education came 9 years ago in the film Waiting for Superman. The documentary told the story of 5 students trying to get out of the rotten public school system and be accepted into schools that might give them a chance for success. It was powerful because people with liberal values were the ones who produced it. Now, George Packer is a staff writer at The Atlantic and would also describe himself as a liberal. That is why his latest article on When the Culture War Comes for the Kids is so powerful. He begins his article by describing the challenges of getting his young son into a private school. then his prospects improve when he is informed that his son made it off the wait list for his preferred public school. If you don't want to read the 25 pages in his story, you might read the insightful summary by Matthew Continetti with the appropriate title, George Packer Gets Mugged by Reality. George Packer and his wife were excited to put their son in what he called a liberal white family's dream. At first, they were pleased with the school. Then, to use his words, things began to change. Leftist perspectives quickly changed the direction of the school. Rage and indignation about Trump and societal injustice became part of the curriculum. Parents opted their children out of standardized tests because they were deemed to be biased and racist. Boy and girl bathrooms were changed to gender-neutral bathrooms. Families split into warring factions. And I might mention that George Packer isn't really reporting anything that many of my radio guests haven't already been describing for decades, but they were conservative and thus easy to dismiss. He is a liberal and now sees how the left and the culture war are ruining education. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Anti-Semitism, go to viewpoints.info/anti-Semitism. Viewpoints.info/anti-Semitism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Couple dates I wanted you to mark. Today is Bring Your Bible to School Day. You might remember that I talked about that because New Orleans Saints quarterback Drew Brees actually recorded a short video encouraging students today to bring their Bible. And, of course, that led to all sorts of criticism of him because he did it with focus on the family, which, again, just you want to see the hostility to various Christian organizations. Just look at this one because Newsweek referred to Focus on the Family. Really? Focus on the Family is an anti-gay group. I might even mention Focus on the Family isn't even headed up by Jim Dobson anymore, so you would really have to have a stretch to come up with that argument. Out Magazine referred to it as an anti-gay extremist group, and so we'll come back and talk about that in just a minute, but that is today, Bring Your Bible to School Day, and we'll maybe cover a little bit more tomorrow in our weekend edition about what actually has happened on some of the school grounds, and so we'll talk about that. But I also want you to realize that a very important date that we like to talk about every single year takes place October 6th, and that is Life Chain. If you're pro-life, sometimes you say, well, what can I do? You know, I really don't have the time to work at a pregnancy resource center, and I appreciate some of the pro-life issues out there, but that's a little tougher for me to actually go down to Austin. This is really simple. It's called Life Chain, and it's an opportunity for you to gather with lots of like-minded pro-life people all over the country. And again, since most of you listening to this broadcast are in the state of Texas, we even have a link so that you can find out where the various life chains are taking place in the state of Texas. If by chance you're listening to this outside of that state, there is also a link to all those other states as well as you go to lifechain.net. To give us a little more perspective on this, we bring back to the microphone Sharron Albertson, who is a campaign volunteer and has been the Life Chain coordinator for many years, a graduate of Pasadena College, which is now Point Loma Nazarene College, has been a teacher, and also, of course, past president of the Golden Corridor Republican Women. And Sharron, thank you for joining us again here on Point of View.
Glad to be with you.
Let's explain Life Chain. We've got a picture here of the 120 people that gathered in Allen, Texas, which is my hometown. But wherever people gather, you have an opportunity to actually have a great testimony. You will show up rain or shine. I don't think we're worried about rain right at this point. And there's an opportunity for you to actually testify to pro-life issues. But talk a little bit more about Life Chain and how people can get involved.
Right. Life Chain is a peaceful, prayerful, public witness of pro-life Americans standing in remembrance of 61 million lives lost to abortion, praying for our nation, for people in crisis situations, and for an end to abortion. It's a visual statement of solidarity by the Christian community that abortion kills children, hurts women and men, and that the church supports the sanctity of human life from the moment of conception to natural death. You can tell that's our statement of belief. So Life Chain, people just show up. Professionally printed signs are provided at the site. On the back of the signs are songs and prayers to be praying during that time. They stand or sit in lawn chairs 20 steps apart so that people going by can actually have a second or two to concentrate on the message on the signs. The signs are adoption, a loving option, abortion kills children, Jesus forgives and heals, Lord forgive us and our nation, abortion hurts women, el aborto mata niños, life the first inalienable right, pray to end abortion. Another one in Spanish that I can't say very well, pregnant, need help, and gives the phone number where people can dial. So we're out there to show them that we care.
I just mentioned that if you are in the state of Texas, most of our listeners this hour are, you've got a listing, and really it's just even a partial listing there, but everything from A to W, from Abilene to Wiley. And so it doesn't matter where you happen to be located in the state. And, of course, a lot of our listeners are in the North Texas area anyway, and those are well covered. And it tells you a great deal, first, about what is happening, where that is. In many cases, it gives you a contact point, and your phone number is on there in case somebody wants to provide additional information or start their own life chain in a different location, or they know of something that needs to be on that sheet. So there's a great way to do so. And as you point out, these are professional signs, and you can kind of figure out which sign you want to maybe hold up. There are some really great resources there. It's an opportunity for people as they're driving by to think about the issue of abortion, which is a topic that a lot of people, as we well know, try to suppress. And every once in a while we get somebody that's honking and upset with us, but most of the time they're honking and appreciating what we are doing. And so give us a little bit more of an idea of how to get kind of prepared for what will be taking place over the weekend.
Well, this is a really great place also to bring teens. We have stories of teens well prepared in advance to be out there who then go back to school and convince their friends not to have an abortion. So families are certainly welcome. We ask them to stand together, not on father on one side of the street, mother on the other, and child suddenly decides to go across. But many pro-life leaders have told us they got their start being in pro-life by being part of a life chain. In fact, 40 Days for Life, Sean Carney was the life chain coordinator in Bryan College Station. They were praying about needing more visibility and praying more than an hour. Life chain is meant to be a first step in pro-life activism. And so the Lord showed them the idea of 40 Days for Life. They called Royce Dunn, the founder of Life Chain 32 years ago, founding Life Chain in California. They called Royce, and he gave them his blessing. And thank the Lord that they have run with it and are able to then really help abortion clinics to be being closed down. So a number of other good things have come from Life Chains. Many pregnancy centers have been started afterwards by people who were part of a life chain saying, we've got to do more than just this hour.
And again, about 90 minutes is what we're talking about here. And you can find out the time and place and those kinds of things. Also, there are life chain principles, 17 different principles I would encourage people to look at, which, for example, suggests that since you're hearing about this right now, it's Thursday, you have enough time to contact your pastor and maybe encourage your pastor to actually lead the congregation or encourage some of the congregation to show up at one of those events. And I have, in some cases, done a life chain in front of the churches that I've attended. So that has been an opportunity. So whether you want to actually stand in front of a street that goes past your church, or whether you'd like to stand in the street that is dedicated in your particular area, there's some real opportunities. And again, if somebody needs some more information, we do have a link to lifechain.net. You can find that very easily by going to our website, pointofview.net, and it will actually give you a list of those in the state of Texas. But if you say, well, I'm not in Texas, all you have to do is just back up and just go to lifechain.net, and then you will find anything for any particular state or location. And if people wanted more information, you're very gracious about putting your phone number up there so they can contact you, can't they?
Right. And if people are hearing about it now and want to put one together, we're really suggesting the alternate date. That's always the last Sunday of October. So this year, October 27th, there will be hundreds of life chains on that date as well. We already have verified more than 1,570 cities and towns, many with multiple locations, so that right at 1,950 locations are listed on the website as verified. So do you have time for my favorite story?
Please.
I've told you this before, but it's still my favorite. There are many others, but a man was standing in front of an abortion clinic in California holding a sign, and a young woman came up to him and said, "My mother remembers you were here 20 years ago. She was pregnant, not married, didn't have a job, and thought abortion was her only choice. And after she saw your sign and talked to you for a few minutes, she decided not to have the abortion that she had scheduled. And I was the baby she would have aborted. Even more, she wanted me to thank you because this is her first grandbaby."
Wow.
And she showed him the baby she was holding.
What a great story. I just love those stories.
That's my favorite. There are many others. How much more time do you have?
Well, I'm going to have to keep you over the break if we're going to do that. Let's take a break, and if you want to tell another story, I'll let you do that after the break. Sharron Albertson with us, and this would be a good time, since we are going to a break, for you to get on your computer, go to lifechain.net, or just simply go to pointofview.net. We'll take you there, and we'll tell you another story, too, just before we let you go, and that is just one great, simple, easy opportunity to go and testify to life at LifeChain coming up this weekend. Let's take a break. We'll hear another story or two right after these important messages.
When you give to Point of View, does it make a difference? Jeremy Dies would tell you that it does. He grew up listening to Point of View in the back seat of his mom's car, and it helped to shape his thinking.
I had parents that were able to sit across from me at the dinner table after we listened to Marlon Maddox and Kerby Anderson years ago and think through what the scriptures say about these issues of current significance in our lives. That's only possible because Point of View has come along and ministered into my life and made me who I am today. And here I am today defending religious liberty, partly because Marlon Maddox and Penn Dexter and Kerby Anderson were the ones that were pushing me towards all that. They taught me how to think through these issues. They didn't tell me what to think. They taught me how to think.
Each gift you give will change lives. Not every Point of View listener will become a Jeremy, but if they listen for very long, they will be changed. And that will change how they impact and affect the lives of the people around them. So make that decision to change a life today. Join the Truth Team and boldly stand for truth in a world of lies, distortion, and information manipulation. Go to pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. That's 1-800-347-5151.
Point of View will continue after this.
are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. But if nothing else, wanted you to mark your calendar. Today is Bring Your Bible to School Day. We'll probably spend a little bit of time tomorrow talking about that and what happened on the various high school campuses. It was supported by Focus on the Family. Of course, New Orleans Saints quarterback Drew Brees did a short video, and that became controversial. And only in this polarized world would a short video by Drew Brees be controversial. We played it before, and everybody just said, really? This is something you're going to even get upset about? But there's the world that we live in. But more importantly, I also want you to mark your calendar for this weekend, because on this October 6th, there is an opportunity for you to participate in Life Chain. And I might also mention, as we mentioned just a minute ago, the alternative date is October 27th. Now, that's oftentimes picked in case there's rain. There's no doubt that there will be a very sunny day, but it's another opportunity both on the 6th of October and the 27th of October to participate in Life Chain. And we have with us for a few more minutes Sharron Albertson, who is, of course, been the coordinator of Life Chain. And you shared one story, and I've heard some others like that from some of our other guests over the years of having a chance to meet a child that was born that they were able to save at a very important pregnancy center or an abortion clinic or whatever it might happen. But Sharron, you wanted to share a few more stories, and I'm all ears because I'd love to hear a few more stories that come out of the pro-life activism that you and many people have been involved with.
Okay, so if people are just hearing about Life Chain, a lady called a few years ago, had just heard about Life Chain and wanted to do it by herself because she didn't want to invite friends if it was too scary or whatever. And I said, well, we don't usually recommend that. Royce Dunn, who is the national director in California, really wants people to be sure to have someone along with them. Well, she wanted to do it by herself. Okay, so she called the police department, let them know. We always do that as a courtesy to them. We're not asking permission. This is our First Amendment right to be out there peacefully holding a sign and praying. And so on the Sunday then, she was glad to be there by herself and praying. And on Monday, she called. She was wound up. Sharron, that was a wonderful experience. I am so glad I was out there. And then the next year, she had 65 friends join her. She was so enthusiastic. Then after that, in this small town, now they have the fire department come out. They put pro-life signs on the fire truck.
Wow.
So it's really a good way for a whole community to come together. In many locations, the pastors of the different churches pass the coordination around. One year it's the pastor of the Baptist church, the next year the Lutheran, the next year the Catholic, and they go over to one of the churches afterwards for punch and cookies. It helps the people to get acquainted with pro-life. The students go back to school knowing friends that are pro-life. They didn't realize those friends were pro-life at their school. So there's another story. A young man was driving along among the signs and thought that he would try one more time to get his girlfriend not to have the abortion that she had scheduled. So he went and really pleading with her, and all right, I won't do it. And so he was so excited, he said, let's go tell my dad. His dad was really hurting because this was going to be the first grandchild. And, okay, let's go tell your dad. The dad then said, hey, let's go see if those people are still downtown so we can thank them. So, and they were. And so they were going along, shaking hands and hugging the people in the Life Chain.
Wow. Just such great stories. Let me just mention again, I see your phone ringing, so you're probably going to get some of these phone calls, but let's talk about the fact that you're going to encourage people not to do it by themselves. But the other question I think some people have is, okay, if I bring a small child in a stroller or something like that,
Yeah.
or if I have an elderly parent, they can sit in a lawn chair. So there's some opportunities for the entire family to get involved, isn't there?
Right. Oh, definitely. Lawn chairs are welcome. Strollers. People put Life Chain signs on the strollers sometimes even.
So again, those are some opportunities. Again, you provide the signs. Probably most of the signs that you normally see: abortion kills children, but also adoption, a loving option, Jesus forgives and heals, Lord, forgive us on our nation, abortion hurts children, and on and on. So there are opportunities for you to stand there and testify to life. And if you've said, I want to get involved, but I don't have a lot of time, or I'm really nervous about even doing something. I'm not the kind of person to drive to Austin and testify on this issue. I'm not necessarily the kind of person to even stand in front of an abortion clinic, and I just really don't know what to do. This is the easiest entry point I can think of, and it has been so successful. This is now the 32nd year for LifeChain. And again, you can go to lifechain.net and you can find out more where the LifeChain is located in your area. So if nothing else, Sharron, I appreciate you sharing the stories, and I appreciate you coming on every year to remind us once again that LifeChain is coming up.
All right. Thank you, Kerby.
Let's, if we can, again, get into a couple of other issues. And just real quickly, let me mention that because we're looking ahead to this issue of LifeChain, I also wanted to mention that today, of course, was Bring Your Bible to School Day. And that's another benefit, whether it's See You at the Pole, which has already taken place, or Bring Your Bible to School Day, which is today. As she points out, sometimes when you have young people, they see, well, oh, I didn't know you were a Christian, but you brought your Bible, or I didn't know you were a Christian and you prayed in front of the flagpole at the school, or I didn't know you were pro-life, but I saw you at the pro-life LifeChain. So these are tremendous opportunities, and they don't require a great deal of courage. Some people said I would never get in front of a group and speak on this issue because I wouldn't get in front of a group to speak on any issue, even as important as it is. And so here is just a great opportunity for young people today to bring their Bible to school. And for those of you that maybe have a child that did, you might ask them if they saw anybody else that brought a Bible, or if you just said, this snuck up on me and I didn't know that, you might ask your child tonight, did you see any of your fellow Christians bringing a Bible? And so there's just a great opportunity to start some conversation. And it is amazing to me that no matter what good is done, there are always people that are critical. As I mentioned just a few minutes ago, there were people that have been critical of the judge for actually going and hugging Amber Geiger and giving her a copy of the Bible and telling her to ask for forgiveness. There have been people critical of this very short video that Drew Brees did, but let's, if we can, give credit where credit is due and accolades, since sometimes the secular media will either ignore them or just simply repeat some of the criticisms that these people actually have been undergoing. And just before we take a break, there's been a lot more to the story I talked about yesterday. Remember, we talked about this hoax of this young girl who is in the 6th grade at Emmanuel Christian School, who alleged that these white boys actually criticized her and forced her to cut off her dreadlocks. And I talked about the fact that Rashida Tlaib actually posted a supportive kind of Twitter post. Well, the first point is it turns out this is now the 4th fake racial hoax that Representative Tlaib has actually tweeted about. And in every case, and again, people look at this more than I do, she's never actually apologized for the fact that she actually was giving high fives and accolades to someone who actually was lying. But the biggest part of the story came out that the reporter who originally broke this story actually is good friends with the family, and the family has beauty products, which include having, natural hair. And so here the reporter who actually started this false dreadlock story actually has been involved with the family in promoting their beauty products and using this to actually help their business. And so as a result, that was the first issue. And then this same reporter actually has been supporting what's called the Crown Act. It's a piece of legislation. It's called Natural Hair Bill. And so it was the idea that we want to actually have young girls that are African American feel good about their natural curly hair and not be forced to be made fun of. And so it is becoming even more incredible the story that is being used right now to actually promote a fake incident was promoted in large part by somebody who may have been using it to try to promote some of the beauty products of the family. And now, of course, the family has apologized for this, but you can find, if you want to look it up, these various videos and these various tweets in which they're showing this young girl actually using some of the hair products, and she was promoting it on the local television program and also has been promoting it in the legislature. So this so-called fake incident, or in many of those cases, they've been fake hate crimes, turns out to have even had a monetary basis behind it as well. So I think it's kind of intriguing to follow that story, and we'll continue to follow it. But we need to take a break. We'll be back right after these important messages.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes, and let me just give you a preview. Next hour, we're going to have in studio with us former senator, as well as, of course, also former president at Heritage Foundation of Jim DeMint and Rachel Bovard, who are both originally with the Heritage Foundation, now, of course, are heading up the Conservative Partnership Institute and this excellent book, Conservative, Knowing What to Keep. And we'll talk about what to keep and what to revise and change. So I think you're going to really enjoy that conversation. And so that is coming up in just a few minutes. And as a kind of a program note, let me just mention that tomorrow I'm going to be doing some teaching during this hour. And then in the next hour, we'll spend some time during our weekend edition talking about, of course, course, impeachment inquiry. We'll talk about campaign 2020, but I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about China because of the 70th anniversary of the communist takeover of China, some of the significant military threats. We'll get a little bit into the whole trade war issue, but it has been kind of intriguing because, as we've talked about, when you look at the so-called reason for impeachment, it has to do with the desire on the part of the people doing an investigation into corruption in Ukraine, having to do with the Bidens. But if you've also been paying attention, we also talked about some of the other issues that have surfaced in the past, and that is what has been happening, for example, when Joe Biden, as vice president, and his son Hunter Biden get on Air Force Two and go to China. And so today, the Associated Press said that even though the president is ensnarled in impeachment investigation, he's now called on China to also probe some of the investigation of Joe Biden. And so Trump said in his remarks to reporters, China should start an investigation into the Bidens. And so I think, instead of kind of putting his tail between his legs or not speaking about this issue, he's actually, in some respects, decided to double down. That doesn't necessarily surprise too many of us. But if nothing else, both Donald Trump and his personal lawyer, which would be Rudy Giuliani, have tried to raise questions about Hunter Biden's business dealings in China. And we've talked about this before in a variety of different contexts. And so we'll see where that takes us. But if nothing else, his reference to China came really from an unrelated question about the July 25th Ukraine call, and said, I have lots of options on China, but they don't want to do what we want. We have tremendous power. So it really kind of brings us down to one of the articles that I thought really kind of reminded us of what is taking place. And Derek Hunter puts it this way: there is a misconception in the public that there are briefcases full of cash changing hands in Washington, D.C., and that votes in the members of Congress are for sale to the highest bidder. He says, now, make no mistake, the votes are still for sale, but the direct cash payments, he says, are mostly gone. Okay, how does that happen? Well, he goes on to explain a couple of things. First of all, of course, he takes a shot at Hunter Biden and saying, how much did he really know about oil and gas business? And the answer to that would be none. But then says, the way this is done is children and spouses of politicians, he says, are raking in cash from campaigns and corporations seeking to buy influence, and it's all legal. Remember, these are the people who write the rules. And so he talks about the fact that you have maybe board seats on various kinds of boards, sweetheart consulting and lobbying contracts, which are kind of the new bags of cash, he says. When a chairman of a specific committee to look favorably on your bids for government contracts, put someone close to them in a position to benefit from it, want protections from regulators or to use regulators to harm your competitors or guard against foreign competition, make the livelihood of someone who matters to the people in power dependent on getting your way, and watch the seas part. And so he gives us lots of examples, and we are, over the next couple of days, certainly going to hear a lot more about the Bidens. But he ends by giving us one other example of someone who's been harshly critical of the President of the United States, and that would be Maxine Waters. He says she won re-election in 2018 with 78% of the vote, even though she doesn't live in the district. He says her job is so safe she could hold a press conference, call her constituents morons, do all sorts of terrible things and still win, and yet she still raises a fortune for her campaign. Because she's the chair of the House Financial Services Committee, it has all sorts of perks, and people with lots of money want to get her attention. So to remain in the good graces of Maxine Waters or any member of Congress, you got to cut a check, whether their campaign needs the money or not. And in the case of Maxine Waters, what she did was hire her daughter to handle campaign mailings to voters. Now, why you need to mail to voters who are re-electing you at a 70% rate, I don't know, but I think you probably do know. And so the Washington Free Beacon reports that Karen Waters, that would be Maxine Waters' daughter, was paid hundreds of thousands of dollars simply to send out mailings for her mother's campaign. Those campaign contributions don't directly go in the pockets of politicians, but they're laundered through the campaigns to the various family members, sometimes even spouses. And again, it's all legal. It shouldn't be, but that's something else. So he said, one of the things that was kind of interesting is I do love this last comment by Derek Hunter. He says, you can say what you want about President Trump, and there's a lot to say, but none of his kids have set up consulting firms or lobbying shops to capitalize on their father's presidency. If they did, he says, the left would never stop screaming. And yet, right out in the open, there are payoffs, kickbacks, graft happening every single day. Hunter Biden is the spotlight right now, and with good reason, but he's just the tip of the iceberg. It's all legal, all out there in the open. Corrupt as hell, he says, and no one is saying a thing about it. So, nothing else, just a reminder that when we talk about this issue of corruption, and especially when the president now says, not only do I want Ukraine to look into this issue, but I want China to look into this issue, I think you're going to start seeing that some of the things we've talked about in the past, and let's be honest, that some of the individuals we've had on the program have been equal opportunity grief givers. I remember years ago, not in this studio, but one of the other studios, years ago, when people started saying, I'm a little bit concerned about some of the things happening with Dennis Hastert, who was Speaker of the House at that time. Well, now we know a lot more about what was happening behind the scenes, and he's a Republican. So when some of these people talk about Republicans, well, as a matter of fact, we just had a Republican step down the other day because of influence peddling. That is the case. But we have a number of Democrats, and if it weren't for some of these other people kind of doing some background investigation, you wouldn't know about it, because as obvious as it is about what is happening, for example, with Maxine Waters, this may be the first time you heard about it right here on Point of View, and you might say, why isn't that part of an investigation that 2020, the Washington Post, the New York Times, hey, National Public Radio would do? You might wait a long time before you hear some of that as well. Well, we're going to spend some time talking about what conservatism is, what it is not. This new book, Conservative, Knowing What to Keep, is something that I think you would benefit from, and we have information about the Conservative Partnership Institute. We have information about Jim DeMint and Rachel Bovard on the website, and we also, of course, have information about the book. And so we're going to spend an hour really kind of getting into what should we keep, then what needs to be changed and revised. And I think you're going to really enjoy the conversation. And so let me encourage you to go to the website, pointofview.net. You're going to find out a lot more about some of the conversations we're going to be having over the next couple of hours. And then we'll have our good friend Ron Rhodes with us as well, as we talk about a chronological tour through the Bible and another very important book that he's written. So we'll do some things in the area of politics, some things in the Bible, all that coming up right after these important messages.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @Point of View RTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, @Point of View RTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today. We have in studio, as I've been talking about, former Senator Jim DeMint. Of course, he also served in the House of Representatives and, of course, was also with the Heritage Foundation, now the Conservative Partnership Institute. And he is one of the authors of this book, Conservative, Knowing What to Keep. We have information about him and his co-author, Rachel, who we're going to introduce in just a minute. But again, Jim DeMint, over the years, we've had you in studio. We've been at various events at Values Voters where we've talked with you and had you by the phone. But it's just always great to have you in this new studio. So thank you for joining us.
It's just so great to be back. And I'm just so appreciative of what you've done for so many years to just be a voice of reason out across the country. And you're in 30-some-odd states right now, and I'm just honored to be with you.
Yeah. I just asked somebody, I think they said 42 states. So that's
42. Okay, well, I'm way behind.
We're trying to get the other 8. You know, I know one of them is Connecticut, and I used to live in Connecticut when I went to Yale, but, you know, we'll keep working on it. But let me also introduce Rachel Bovard, and she used to be with the Heritage Foundation, a graduate of Grove City, and also George Washington University.
Yes,
and it is just great to have you here as well.
Thanks so much. It's my pleasure.
And I'm going to throw these up, and it's going to be doubles tennis every once in a while. Sometimes she's got it, whoever. But I found the book very helpful because, first of all, maybe I'll just ask you, Jim, we are talking about people that say they're conservative and they really aren't. We're in the election season. You know it as well as I do. Every Republican running during the primary is a conservative. And then they go off to Washington, D.C., or they go to Albany, New York, or they go to Tallahassee, Florida, they go to Sacramento, California, they go to Austin, Texas. We find out they're not so conservative, right?
Exactly. And the main point of the book is to define what conservatism really is for Americans. We want them to know that it's not just about politics. It is about knowing what to keep. It is about those things that make our lives better. A part of that is keeping our faith, keeping our covenants as we the people, keeping our differences. We'll go through some of that today. But we can't build a national movement, a conservative movement, if people don't know what it is. And the left is trying to define it as hateful and bigoted and racism. And so many on the right are just talking about conservatism in terms of their preferred policies. But it's much more than that. And for Christians in this country today, it is a perfect fit with what they know makes their lives better.
Again, there are 12 chapters, and half a dozen of those knowing what to keep, half of those on knowing what to fix. And so we'll try to cover both of those. And if you find yourself saying, I'd like to know more, well, that's why we're talking about the book, and it is available. We have a link to the website, of course, the Conservative Partnership Institute, but also you can get it on Amazon and other places as well. And Rachel, let me come to you for just a minute, because one of the things I thought would be really relevant is we do a millennial roundtable. And even though these are really smart people that we bring in on Tuesday, I bet if I said, who is Russell Kirk, they'd all say, I'm not sure who that is. And it is something that we need to bring to this next generation, your generation. True?
Yeah, I think that's right. And if they didn't know Russell Kirk, it's because they didn't go to Grove City College. I'll tell you that much. But yeah, we spent a lot of time with Russell Kirk, who is the father of conservatism.
That's
for
true.
A lot of folks. Wrote The Conservative Mind.
That's right.
Really brought conservatism, from Edmund Burke in the 1700s forward into the modern era. And what we really try to do in this book is to re-articulate a lot of the Kirkian conservative traditions for this current generation. And, you know, Kirk says that that's the job of conservatives. He says every generation needs to be reminded of what conservative principles are. And so we're sort of taking up the mantle humbly that Kirk has given us to do just that.
And I'm just thinking that Jim DeMint and I are about the same age. And when I was growing up in California, we had a guy that ran for governor by the name of Ronald Reagan.
Right.
And it's interesting because my father ran for the California Assembly in 1962, which is the year which Richard Nixon ran as governor. They both lost. And then he ran in 64, and that's when Barry Goldwater was running. They both lost. But then in 1966, something changed, and that is Ronald Reagan won, and my dad got involved in all sorts of other activities. But Ronald Reagan used to say that really this idea of America, the republic, conservatism, it's not passed on through the bloodline. You know, you have to pass the baton on from one generation to the next.
Every generation has to fight for freedom. It doesn't come to us naturally. And this generation, and I think even a lot in our generation, don't know what those things are that blessed us so much as a country. And so what Conservative does, the book Conservative, is just help people look at the thing much broader than politics. The things in our civic society, our families, our communities, our churches, the things that really create the lives that we value. We need to know what they are and know who's trying to take them away. And more importantly, why are they trying to take them away? That's what the second part of the book is about.
Let's get to chapter 1. It talks about covenants. Rachel, let me talk about that for just a minute. If you've been to Hillsdale or Grove City or a few other places, maybe you could answer that. But you talk about this idea of an American covenant. And we, many times around here, talk about biblical covenants. But that's an important first chapter in the book, isn't it?
Yeah, it really sets the stage for what conservatism is. And it was actually Senator DeMint that really keyed into this concept of covenant. And I think it's so appropriate because the idea of covenant is simply that, you know, we are in covenant with one another, right? We're in covenant with Christ through our faith. We're in covenant with one another through marriage. But as citizens, we're also in covenant. And I think that speaks to a lot of what we've lost in our modern political discourse. You know, people aren't taking care of one another. They don't look at themselves as a country together. We've lost the unum in e pluribus unum to some extent, and that's a reflection of the covenant principle. And so that really leads into a lot of the other conservative principles but it starts fundamentally with this idea that we have a responsibility to ourselves and each other and the country, and that is the covenant we are all trying to keep. How we meet that out is our politics, but overall, this is the agreement that we need to keep.
And we talk about a social contract, but that's a very different idea, isn't it, than covenant, isn't it?
Very different because it doesn't have that mutual commitment that comes with it. And it's not a top-down phenomenon. And so much of politics today is dividing us all into groups, fomenting mistrust, trying to play one against another, and telling us that only government can save us from this other group. The covenant idea just is built from the ground up. All the little platoons that Burke talked about, helping us understand that we are fellow Americans. We may have different politics, we may be in different denominations or churches, but we have a covenant with each other as citizens that makes us one. It doesn't mean we're not different, but we are one as American citizens. And in fact, I think a lot of that, it still exists across the country. If you get outside of Washington, outside the media, Americans love each other. We work together. We go to school together. And it's only the higher-ups who are trying to gain political power by dividing us by beliefs, by race, by gender. So this covenant idea is the very beginning of understanding who we are as a country. And it really goes back to the covenant God made with the people of Israel, with Moses, and the covenanting with God and with each other. And that gives us the civility to deal with all the things that we have to deal with as a society.
One of the chapters, of course, keeping our covenants and also keeping our faith. And we'll talk about that after the break because, again, that's an important aspect of that as well. De Tocqueville and others will bring some of that to the conversation. Then also keeping our differences, keeping our republic, keeping our institutions and traditions. That's an important one. And keeping our land of opportunity. That's just the first 6 chapters. We'll try to cover as much as we can. But we'll do that right after these important messages.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
One of the most powerful critiques of public education came 9 years ago in the film Waiting for Superman. The documentary told the story of 5 students trying to get out of the rotten public school system and be accepted into schools that might give them a chance for success. It was powerful because people with liberal values were the ones who produced it. Now, George Packer is a staff writer at The Atlantic and would also describe himself as a liberal. That is why his latest article on When the Culture War Comes for the Kids is so powerful. He begins his article by describing the challenges of getting his young son into a private school. Then his prospects improve when he is informed that his son made it off the wait list for his preferred public school. If you don't want to read the 25 pages in his story, you might read the insightful summary by Matthew Continetti with the appropriate title, George Packer Gets Mugged by Reality. George Packer and his wife were excited to put their son in what he called a liberal white family's dream. At first, they were pleased with the school. Then, to use his words, things began to change. Leftist perspectives quickly changed the direction of the school. Rage and indignation about Trump and societal injustice became part of the curriculum. Parents opted their children out of standardized tests because they were deemed to be biased and racist. Boy and girl bathrooms were changed to gender-neutral bathrooms. Families split into warring factions. And I might mention that George Packer isn't really reporting anything that many of my radio guests haven't already been describing for decades, but they were conservative and thus easy to dismiss. He is a liberal and now sees how the left and the culture war are ruining education. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Anti-Semitism, go to viewpoints.info/antisemitism. Viewpoints.info/antisemitism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, talking about this new book, Conservative, Knowing What to Keep. And a little bit later, we're going to talk about knowing what to fix. But knowing what to keep and the importance of faith. And in there, you use some good examples. You know, the Boy Scouts of America were the very center of American life. And now they're one of the most vilified organizations in the 21st century. You talk about Masterpiece Cake. And, of course, we could talk about all the individuals that we've talked with, whether it's Jay Sekulow, certainly Kelly Shackelford and others. But these are all very important cases. And I think right now, wouldn't you say, Jim, that we are kind of in a balance between are we going to really understand the importance of religious liberty, or are we just going to simply see that as an excuse for anti-LGBTQ kinds of things?
It's an important time because I really do feel we're at a crossroads, particularly in Washington. And we point out in the book a number of the hearings that they have now for confirmation. Christianity's on trial.
Yes. I
mean, they are saying you should not confirm someone if they believe Jesus Christ is the only way to heaven. And that's against the Constitution, yet they do it blatantly now in Washington. Russell Kirk said the very beginning of a free society and of conservatism is a belief in the transcendent order.
Right.
And in other places, he said a belief in a fixed moral code. And that is another thing that can unite us as a country if we all believe in this order. We might have different versions of God, different denominations, but if we all understand there is a transcendent order that we all are under, that is our master in effect and not the government, then we behave very differently as citizens, and it takes us back to the covenant idea, me, you, and God. We're going to behave very differently if it's me, you, and government.
Yes. And founders, I would think, Rachel, are individuals that understood that this would only work. A constitution really only works if you have a moral and religious people. Because if you have to have a police officer on every street corner and you don't have people doing the right thing without coercion, it's just never going to work.
That's right. And the founders really understood that it wasn't just one religion, right? It was this transcendent order. You had framers that were Unitarian, they were deists, they were Catholics, they were Protestants, but they believed in the idea that we still know to be true, that a religious society is full of happier people, more responsible people. They look out for one another. But the left, their religion now is atheism. It's a secular society. They want religion to have no place in it. And the role of conservatives is not to say you have to believe what I believe. It's that belief is good.
Yeah.
And that's where we're at right now.
Yes. Well, again, there are so many other points, but I want to keep moving because another one is keeping our differences. That gets us into identity politics. Jim DeMint, speak to that, if you might, for just a minute.
Well, the left claims to be for diversity, but if you're around them at all, they want uniformity in almost everything that you believe in value. They try to make differences based on just color of skin or surface ideas like that, but they really do not tolerate differences of opinion. If you don't agree with them, you're wrong. And they are becoming vicious and even violent about people who disagree with them. They don't even want to consider the facts about any of their big issues. But conservatism is really, like Russell Kirk says, celebrating people's differences, promoting and protecting those differences. And that's how you live together in peace if you're all different. And your neighbors can be completely different from you, and you can be great friends as long as he doesn't tell you you have to be like he is. Mm. And that's the problem of top-down central management, particularly when the federal government is telling all the states and all the people that they have to do certain things. They have to go to certain schools. They have to have certain health care. They have the same. That's when people get tense. That's when they become divisive. But diversity is a core principle of conservatism.
We're going to talk a little bit later about what to fix, and part of that is the left. And even just recently, we had Dennis Prager sit in that very chair here, and he's made an argument that I agree with, that it is traditionally conservatives and liberals may have disagreed, but even our liberal friends, and I've had Alan Dershowitz on many times before, he would be the typical liberal, or Jordan Peterson has been on, and some of these people that would basically say, I may disagree with you, but I support your right to say that. Mm-hmm. And so that's been the case, and that's been the view that liberals and conservatives have had. But the left says, no, you don't have a right to that point of view. And any kind of view that strays even a little bit from the plantation is something that immediately will cause people to riot, to prevent you from speaking. And I've been the recipient of some of that on college campuses and things like that. And so, Rachel, this kind of new generation is saying, we don't want to hear this. We just want trigger warnings. We want safe spaces, and we don't want to wrestle with the big ideas.
Yeah, we call those snowflakes, I think is what we call them. But it is a really dangerous thing. You know, I think it reflects poorly on an understanding of what America was founded on, which is incredible diversity. We have one of the most diverse societies in the world. And that is a fundamentally conservative idea to protect that diversity. I think this generation, my generation as a millennial and the generation below me, they get caught up between conflating equality of opportunity with equality of outcome. Mm-hmm. And they don't understand that in the middle of that are people exercising their own individual choices and individual gifts. And that's what makes American society unique, is that everybody has a different thing to offer and everybody has a chance to offer it here. And we don't do a good job, I think, of communicating the value in that.
And again, one of those is keeping our land of opportunity. And one of the booklets I have is on capitalism and socialism. Why do I have this one? Because unfortunately, your generation, not you and not many of our millennial roundtable people, but a very high percentage of individuals who identify as Generation Y or millennials or Generation Z or the iGen generation say, you know, I think socialism is better than capitalism. I want to send them to Venezuela or Cuba to figure that out. But, Jim, that's kind of a generational thing. We're old enough to remember when we say socialism, we think Soviet Union, we think North Korea, we still even see China, a topic we'll be addressing in the future. But the younger generation says, oh, I kind of like Bernie Sanders. I kind of like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. And so this is another great challenge for the 21st century, isn't it?
It really is, and it's harder for younger people, and we pointed out in the book. You and I have the benefit of time. We've watched things. We've made our own mistakes. We've seen countries come and go. We know socialism doesn't work. Part of the problem that millennials have is not only have they not seen outcomes over time, but they have not been taught the mechanics behind the prosperity that we have right now. And we call it capitalism or free market economics, but they have different views of what socialism is. They really don't understand socialism in its real sense. And so it's been masquerading as compassion, as let's share and everything. But once you talk to millennials directly and younger people directly about what this means, okay, we're all going to get C's because some got D's and some got, you put it in their terms and all of a sudden they say that's not fair. That's the first thing that comes out of their mouth.
Yeah, it goes to a really good point, I think, that doesn't resonate enough. It's very, very easy in a socialist country to make everybody the same at the bottom. It is very, very hard to make everybody the same at the top. And so socialism, in its natural progression, distills us all down to the very, very bottom. And if that's where everybody wants to live, I highly doubt they do, but that is the logical conclusion of socialism.
And one of the things that you do, and I hold this up at least for people watching, it's just an unbelievable chart, and it's something we've talked about with many people, how because of a free market, the world's GDP or GNP, whichever one you want to use, is just gone almost exponential, and we have raised more and more people out of extreme poverty. So it is a time when we have perhaps the greatest economic development, the greatest standard of living, and yet, unfortunately for your generation, we have what I write about, what I call the deaths of despair. Higher suicide rate than even I had when I was growing up in Berkeley, California. We have individuals with opioid overdoses. So even at a time with tremendous blessings, just a lot of pessimism and depression and a belief that socialism is the way out.
Yeah, and this really gets back to what it means to be a conservative, because all of those things you cite, these despair, these are existential questions. These are philosophical questions about how we live together. The left's answer is everything is fixed by the government. Conservatives, on the other hand, say, no, there's way more important things in life than politics, and one of them is family, church, or community. All these things matter.
When, again, you also talk about this, and we'll get into this in the next hour, government is the answer. See, this is the government that supposedly had shovel-ready projects that weren't shovel-ready. This is the government that allowed veterans to die because of problems at the VA. This is a government that was supposed to make affordable care, because it was called the Affordable Care Act, and it doesn't look very affordable. And we think that more government is the answer. Bernie Sanders, call your office. I don't think so. Let's take a break, though. When we come back, we have a lot more to cover, and we've just barely touched on knowing what to keep. But we do need to spend some time talking about knowing what to fix. And that's something we talk about every day here on Point of View. And if you find yourself saying, I'd like to know more about the Conservative Partnership Institute, we have a link to it at our website, pointofview.net. If you'd like to know about the book, we have information and a link to that as well. And if, as you're listening to this, you say, I know somebody that needs to hear this, you can click on the button that says listen, and you can download the podcast and send it to them. Or you can click on the button that says watch. And of course, you can watch the live stream, or it'll also be on YouTube. You may know some other millennials that need to hear this as well. But we'll take a break and come back with more right after this.
So when people first hear about Medi-Share, they have questions. Some good ones, like, what is it? Well, Medi-Share is a Christian healthcare sharing ministry. It's not health insurance. It's a different way of doing things, which leads us to this question. Why do so many become Medi-Share members? Two big reasons. They save a lot. The typical family saves $500 a month, and they feel great about it. With Medi-Share, you aren't forced to pay for things you don't believe in. Find out more. 855-SHARE-40. That's 855-SHARE-40.
It seems we can't get through a day without hearing how science has been corrupted to support political goals. Media entities have sold out truth for the sake of favored narratives. Even some religious groups have abandoned the Bible to support things based on feelings. So who can you trust? Kerby Anderson and the Point of View Truth Team are your source for real news. Learn how you can make a difference by joining the team at pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. In a world of unending fog, Point of View is a shining light. Do your part at pointofview.net/team or 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again as we talk about this new book, Conservative, Knowing What to Keep. Jim DeMint with us, Rachel Bovard. And again, if you would like to join us, you could maybe give us a call, 1-800-351-1212. But I suspect this is going to be one of those programs where I'm going to encourage you maybe just to sit back, listen, take some notes. Then maybe, since it comes very fast and furious, go and listen to the podcast again. Maybe send it to someone, and most importantly, get a copy of the book. Endorsed by a number of people, including Mark Levin and, of course, a number of other members of Congress that have actually written this, including Congressman Jim Jordan. So just a lot of great material in this book. And so I'm going to dive deep again. And one of the things that's kind of a theme running through this, Rachel, is tradition. Now, your generation sometimes said, why do I need to worry about the past? But tradition helps us understand how not to make the mistakes of the past. Would you agree?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I think conservatives get a really bad rap for this. You know, people think of conservatives as sort of fusty. You can't do this, you can't do that. But that's not it at all, right? Conservatism, more than anything else, is a philosophy of gratefulness. And this is particularly true about tradition. We're really grateful for what people have done before, the hundreds of years of experience they've given us tackling the same problems, because human nature doesn't change. The same problems come up and up and up again. And so looking back at what's worked, what hasn't worked, and allowing that to inform the discussion going forward, that is essentially conservative. And so that's that concept. You know, Edmund Burke really talked about standing on the shoulders of giants and looking forward and taking that accumulated wisdom and using it to our benefit. That's incredible that we have that opportunity. And that's what's really exciting about being a conservative.
And that kind of gets into Chapter 7, if you think about this, because it gets into this issue of good intentions. When Dennis Prager was here recently, he had an equation, GI minus W equals E, and that was good intentions minus wisdom leads to evil. And in this chapter, you talk about the fact that people have good intentions, but if you don't have any collective wisdom, I don't think too many people wake up each morning and say, now, how can I ruin the United States of America?
Right.
How can I ruin my country in Ukraine or my country in Hungary or wherever it might be? But if you don't have some sense of tradition, some sense of, if you will, wisdom that you gain, you sometimes, in trying to do good, do tremendous harm.
We've seen a lot of that at the federal government level. There are a lot of folks up there who have very good intentions and good motives. I'm afraid the left and the progressives have gone over to the evil side, but they're bringing a lot of good people along with them. But folks who want to do the right thing and don't have any of the knowledge of what's worked in the past or any respect for the things that have worked are likely just to take these new theories and ideas of, okay, how can we help the poor? Let's just give them money. Let's just give them housing. But if you look at it over time, we have not helped them. We've ensnared them and trapped them in dependency, and we haven't given them a way out. We've taken their dignity, and that's not right. It's not right for our country, and it's not right for the individuals. So if you really are compassionate, let's look at what has really helped people over time. And so it relates to raising children. It relates to being a community volunteer. But when you get at the government level, if you think the way I'm going to help is to get government to do it, I have not seen that work yet.
Again, the war on poverty and poverty won, right?
Yeah.
You know, I mean, that's a good example of that. And it really gets to Chapter 8 as well, and that is not just only good intentions, but one of the things you say there, and something we've talked about before, the left almost seems to destroy everything that it touches. And it isn't just in the political realm, because we also talk about how it's affected the cultural realm, and we could get into all sorts of transgender issues and cultural issues and sexual issues and gender confusion and all the rest. But just even back to government policies, in trying to do good, we've done a great deal of harm, haven't we?
We sure have. You mentioned the Boy Scouts. And the Boy Scouts were one of the foundational institutions in our country, and so many of the great leaders in our country and astronauts, business leaders over time have gone through this Boy Scout program. But over the years, they were attacked. Over 30 lawsuits. I wrote a book over 10 years ago, and I was so proud of them for withstanding that. But the government, the media, and particularly corporate donors eventually just wore them down. They threw out their moral code, and now they're on the verge of bankruptcy, and you don't see anyone from the left coming to help them, to rescue them. And that's what the left does. They tear things down. It's not enough for them to have the freedom to do what they want to do. They don't want others to have the freedom to do something else. And that's what we're seeing more and more today, is just a destruction of those traditions, those ideas that have held this country up for so long, and they're not putting anything in its place.
Rachel, I thought we maybe also talk about the need to get alternative sources of information. First of all, you write the Weekly Compass, which is available at the Conservative Partnership Institute. But whether it's that or this talk show or a variety of other outlets, if all you knew about what indeed the left wanted to do came from reading the New York Times or the Washington Post, then you would be concluding that that is the solution. But when you actually look at some of the other studies, matter of fact, some of the ones you did at the Heritage Foundation and others, you realize that in many cases, almost every time the left touches something, they ruin it.
Yeah. If all you read is the New York Times, you are in dire straits. You must think we are on the precipice of destruction based on everything they put out every day. We're actually doing much better than that. You know, Senator DeMint travels a whole lot. We hear from people all over the country that are very conservative at heart. They want to keep what's important to them, and they're grateful for the sacrifices that have made this country strong. But I think to that point, that's why it's so important to get outside of the bubbles that you're constantly in. I write the Weekly Compass email, which you can sign up for on our website, that tries to tell you a little bit about what's going on in Washington from a conservative perspective. But, you know, I write for a lot of conservative media organizations, The Federalist, Washington Examiner, American Greatness. These are all really good places to get a different view than the one you're getting on your cable news.
And so, again, that's one of the reasons we're doing this today here on Point of View. And if nothing else, one of the things that people have always appreciated, Babe, since you're authors, it's really nice to have an entire hour to try to talk about a book instead of, a 2-minute soundbite.
Thank you for that.
or all sorts of conversations about everything other than what's in the book. And so I thought we'd come back to one of the chapters there, the siren song of socialism.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we've already sort of addressed that. But, Rachel, let me stay with you for just another few minutes, because when you go and do surveys, and we've done some of those, and we ask people your age or younger, why do you like socialism? The word that comes up is equality. Mm-hmm. And I saw how the word equality was used to justify same-sex marriage, and I see how equality now is being used to suggest socialism. You pointed out that socialism can make everybody equal at the lowest rung, but it gets back to this idea of the equality of opportunity rather than the equality of outcome. Sometimes we might say, I feel like it doesn't seem right that some of these NBA players or NFL players make so much more than a hardworking teacher in the ghetto region. But once you have freedom, you're going to have different outcomes. And it seems to me that we should give everybody the opportunity to pursue their hopes and dreams, but that isn't going to give you the same kind of outcome.
That's right. And it really goes to the fact that we're not all the same person. And that should be celebrated. The left always talks about diversity, but they don't want you to actually have different gifts and use them accordingly, because that leads to different outcomes. But that's an incredibly important part of being conservative, is celebrating those differences and the ability to make choices based on the diversity that you have. C.S. Lewis makes a really good analogy to this in the Screw Tape Letters. If anyone's familiar with this book, when Screw Tape is training the next generation of devils, he said the first thing you have to do to get at their souls is to make them all equal. Because you take a scythe and you cut off the tall wheat and you make it the same as everybody else, and then they just stop caring. And they don't care about anything anymore.
A lot of wisdom there.
Yeah, C.S. Lewis. And one of the things I want to talk about, maybe when we come back from the break, is you also have a whole section here on some of the policy failures. Mm-hmm. We've already talked about the war on poverty, but I'd like to get some thoughts maybe from you, Jim DeMint, about the issue of education and, of course, health care. And, of course, we can also talk about climate change, another one of those topics that we've addressed. But it does seem to me that this is a classic illustration of trying to do good. We've done a great deal of harm. And I just cannot, even as we look at the various elections, see how anybody looking at the cost of Medicare for all, the Green New Deal, trying to make sure that we provide all sorts of benefits for people in terms of child care, make sure that we can forgive all college loans. Rachel might like that one, or a variety of others, or reparations, and not just reparations for African Americans, even reparations for LGBT and all the rest, how people don't look at that and go, That makes absolutely no sense at all. So let me just take a break, and when we come back, we'll talk about this. But as we mentioned, you can go to conservativepartnership.org, and we have a link there on the website. And, of course, you can get a copy of the book, and that is available there. We also have that as well. We also have some of the endorsements that have come from Senator Mike Lee and Representative Mark Meadows and Jim Jordan and Mark Levin and a variety of others. But if you'd like to get that weekly compass, I'm going to sign up for it, and I'm going to find out what Rachel is writing about. That's another one of those maybe must-reads for everybody, so you can sign up. All you really need to do is just put your name there, your zip code, and your email. You can join and find out a little bit more about that. And, of course, if you'd like to really learn about this topic, this is a great book to get that information. So we're going to take a break and talk about some of those policy failures right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes talking about conservative, knowing what to keep, and, of course, also the Conservative Partnership Institute. We have that link on our website. Jim DeMint, let me come to you for just a minute. Chapter 10 talks about these policy failures on the left. We've mentioned some like poverty, but what about education? When we got the federal government involved in education, and I remember at the time when Jimmy Carter created a Department of Education, right. And then the Republicans said, oh, we're going to get rid of it. And then we put Bill Bennett in there and said, well, we kind of like Bill Bennett. And Gary Bauer was there for a while until he went to the domestic policy, and we didn't get rid of that. I think federal government's involvement in education has done more harm than good. What's your thoughts?
There's no question about it. And we cannot maintain a free society if the education of our children is managed by our government. It's completely opposite. We're supposed to hold the government accountable, but yet we have the government running our public schools and essentially our universities through the grants and funding process. But the solutions are so clear. We have so many examples now that states are doing things that give parents more choice. And the idea of education savings accounts opens the door for Christian families to use money without any government strings to actually send their children to a place that will help them raise their children under the admonition of the Lord. And every church in the country could easily hire a teacher or two, and whether it's a class of 20 or several hundred. But you also could have all kinds of different schools that specialize. It would attract a lot of private sector money investing if you created a mall of education where kids could go. We don't have to be strapped to government-run schools. And as long as we do, and if people don't understand this, even if they think their school is good, the national teachers unions, which are socialist at the leadership level, are driving public education in America. And it's really the socialist left that's driving a lot of higher education as well. So we have numerous states now that have done various versions of charters and magnets, and we can see that every time they do it, you create better options for students, but also public education gets better. So we're not eliminating something that parents want, but for heaven's sakes, let's stop doing something that has failed since that very time Jimmy Carter intruded the federal government into education.
And a lot of times people do say, Jim, that, well, this is a good teacher. But my argument is, put a good teacher in a bad system, and the system wins. And that's really what's happened. There may be good teachers, but the system just drives it in the wrong direction. And, of course, the teachers' unions do as well.
Yeah, we can't expect 2 hours of church on Sunday and like 40 hours of secular education that our children will grow up without conflicted ideas of what is real in the world. And that really pains me, because you might have a very good teacher, but if everything is taught within a secular setting, the biology, creation, everything, our children are not going to grow up with confidence in their faith.
Yes. Rachel, Jim mentioned something just in passing, and that is some of us remember when people like Ronald Reagan talked about the states being, if you will, laboratories for democracy. And we see that with education. I just wrote something recently about some really significant changes in health care and health savings accounts in Indiana. Who was the former governor of Indiana? Oh, I think it's the vice president.
I think it rhymes with Mike Pence.
Yes, and it's just, I think there's a good example of sometimes we find things work at the state level, let's make it national. Our friends on the left, they want to just have everything from a national point of view, and oftentimes implemented by people that have never run a business and really have never even been in a think tank to actually understand the implications of what they've just implemented.
Yeah, and it goes back to the fact that they want to make us all the same. They think we are all the same. And that's one of the beautiful things about our federalist system, is that it recognizes that we're not. It recognizes that people in Montana have very different needs than people in New York. We have a system that reflects that. And it really is something to be grateful for. We can experiment at the state level. We can learn from things that work and don't work. Look at California implementing all these policies that are actually making their residents flee to other states because they're taxed to oblivion and they don't like their policies. That's good to know. That maybe the rest of us don't want to live under those scenarios.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, they're paying a lot more for gas, and that's because they're more dependent on Saudi Arabia oil than anybody else. As an individual who's born in California and understands that it's a very different world than when Ronald Reagan was the governor. I mean, they're closing down refineries. They are not drilling new oil wells. And so they're paying a lot more for gas than the rest of the nation listening to this broadcast right now. And that's just one good illustration. But we're just about out of time. And you have a whole section here on, you know, the flourishing of society and the need to get involved. And one of the booklets I'm going to put out again, Making Your Vote Count. It seems to me, Jim DeMint, you've been on the receiving end of various campaigns and worked in other campaigns. You worked in advertising, but you recognize that if we could just mobilize even just the listeners to Point of View to make sure that they are registered to vote, and I suspect many of them are, but then to get their friends, neighbors, coworkers, and family members registered to vote, and then to turn out to vote, these ideas would be implemented instantaneously, and we wouldn't be fighting some of these battles we're fighting right now on Capitol Hill.
You're exactly right. And I've seen data, and I think it's right, that over half of folks who go to church, evangelical Christians, don't vote. Yet we sit on the sidelines and complain about it, and we expect things to work out. Or maybe we believe that politics has nothing to do with our families, our faith, and our freedom. But I can tell you, it does. And we cannot allow the country to continue to go on an unsustainable course. And it really is, fiscally, culturally. I just would encourage folks to register to vote, plan to go out. But like you said, just encourage someone else to go. Take someone else. Make it a thing in your small group or your church or the people you hang out with. If we could just get good common sense Americans to vote, I think we could turn this country around. And I hope folks will read the book just to find out what it is we're trying to do, what are we trying to keep, and how does that translate into policy.
Yes, and anybody that has any doubts, you can go to our website. I've been collecting over the years some of the closest votes in American history. Had somebody sitting in that chair the other day that won by 30 votes, so he recognizes. But I did have an individual I used to work with when we were on Moody Broadcasting, and it actually ended up to be a tie. And so they flipped a coin, and she lost. And then she went to church that Sunday and said, "Oh, if I'd only known that this was going to be that close, I, was working late at work and I didn't bother to go to the vote, and or I was out of town." And she identified 30 people in her own church. If just one of them had voted, she would have been reelected in the Illinois legislature. So don't tell me that one vote does not matter. Rachel, just before we run out of time, let's, if we can, real quickly talk about what's available at your website. And again, I would encourage people to just click on your picture there, and we have information at conservativepartnership.org. And if they scroll down, they get the weekly compass. What is that all about?
Yeah, so it's a weekly email that I write based on what's going on Capitol Hill that conservatives should care about from a House and Senate perspective. So if you want behind the curtain, inside information, sign up for my email.
Again, conservative, knowing what to keep. Senator Jim DeMint, it's been great to interact with you over the years, and thank you for the work that you've done first in Congress, as well as the Heritage Foundation, and now, of course, at the Conservative Partnership Institute. And Rachel, just great to meet you. Can we get you on the Millennial Roundtable in the future?
I would love to.
Okay. Well, it has been just a great opportunity to hear from them. And again, if you would like some more information, click on the button that we have there. It says conservativepartnership.org. And again, there is this opportunity for you to sign up, and I'm going to do that in just a minute, the Weekly Compass, and then you can find some of their material. But if you say, I really want to pass this on to some individuals, go to our website, pointofview.net. There's a red button there. One is listen, and you can download the podcast. Even right now, send it by email to somebody that you think needs to hear this. Or you can watch it, or even go to the YouTube channel a little bit later and pass that on. Because, as we've pointed out before, there's a whole generation of young people that don't know these values, and so we need to pass them on to them. So thank you both for being in the studio. We've got a lot more to cover. We will do that right after these important messages.
There's an old saying that the first casualty in war is truth. Maybe that helps you understand what's happening in America right now. Thankfully, it's not a war with bullets, but there is a war for control. Control of the country and control of your pocketbook. Truth is under fire, but you can help turn the tide by supporting Truth. Join the Truth Team at Point of View Radio. Learn how you can make a difference at pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. Don't let truth become a casualty on your watch. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151.
So what would you do with an extra $500 a month in your budget? Pay off loans, save it, do something fun? Well, it's something you may need to think about if you become a member of MediShare MediShare is a Christian healthcare sharing ministry, and it works. You can save big time on your healthcare costs, and you don't have to pay for things you don't believe in either. Find out more. Call 855-SHARE-40. That's 855-SHARE-40. 855-SHARE-40.
Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of view, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
This hour we're going to get back to the Bible, and this is a great opportunity to talk with our good friend Dr. Ron Rhodes, an individual that is an author of more than 70 books. I can think of a number like the End Times in Chronological Order, Bible Prophecy Answer Book, Unmasking the Antichrist, great debates on Bible prophecy, 40 Days Through Revelation, 40 Days Through Daniel, as well as North Storm Rising, and a variety of other books that he has written over the years. Individual that holds both a THM and a THD degree in systematic theology from Dallas Theological Seminary, is a teacher at Dallas Theological Seminary, as well as Veritas Evangelical Seminary, Talbot Seminary, Biola University, and a number of others. And we oftentimes talk about prophecy with him, and we will in just a few minutes talk about one of his other books. But I wanted to also let you know about a very good book that would kind of help you put the Bible together. It's called A Chronological Tour Through the Bible. It is broken down into 365 days, and it's just a great way to begin to understand the Bible, put it in the right order. It's broken down into 9 different eras. And Dr. Ron Rhodes, always great to have you on the program with us.
Well, thank you, Kerby. It's always a pleasure for me. Thanks.
We're going to do a prophecy in just a minute, and that is certainly a question that a lot of people have in light of what's been happening in Saudi Arabia with the drone attack, what's happening in Iran, what has been happening in Syria. Just the other day, we talked about how an Iranian general says that actually removing Israel would be something that is quite possible. So there's a lot of prophetic things to talk about, but I thought for just a minute I would focus on this book that is published by Harvest House. It's a 1-year chronological tour through the Bible, and I think one of the blessings is that people sort of read the Bible in fits and starts, bits and pieces, and what you do is you try to break it down into a meaningful chronology so that it finally makes sense and helps people understand how to put the whole Bible together. So talk about how people can benefit from this particular chronological tour through the Bible.
Well, the Bible from Genesis to Revelation is really a story of human redemption. And when you take a chronological approach to the Bible, you can actually understand the redemption drama as it chronologically unfolded back in ancient times. And so that helps us to understand the drama in context. It also helps us to understand the drama in real history, and I think that that's a good thing. But one of the things I discovered as I was writing this book on the chronology of the Bible is that Bible chronology itself is a rich soil for the growth of controversies. Have you noticed that?
Yes, and I was just going to get to that next point, because not everybody first of all, the Bible's generally in chronological order, but not exactly, and all it takes is a couple of places where there's one of these intramural discussions about where this fits in the Old Testament, for example, that causes all sorts of people to write whole doctoral dissertations on that, right?
Well, that's right, and obviously this is an obvious a controversy, not just for the scholars, but even for lay people. There are many areas of disagreement that relate to Bible chronology. Just to mention a few, what about the days of creation? Were they 24 hours each, or were they ages of time? That's an issue of Bible chronology. And that brings up related issues like young earth versus old earth, creationism versus evolution or theistic evolution, What about the extended lifetimes of people like Adam who lived 930 years? Is that literal or figurative? Well, that relates to Bible chronology. What about the book of Job? It's right in the middle of the Old Testament, but, it really belongs closer to Genesis. What about the book of Revelation? When was it written? Was it written early, as in 70 A.D. or prior to 70 A.D., as some people try to argue? Or was it late, back around 95 A.D.? And what about the teachings of Jesus during the 3-year ministry in the 4 Gospels? There's a lot of discussion about what happened when, because the 4 Gospels don't portray things in the exact same order. And so what I'm trying to say is that there's just one controversy after another that emerges when you're talking about Bible chronology. And so let me just warn you, Kerby, if you ever want to write a book like this in the future, there's a lot of study you have to do. There's a whole lot of issues.
Well, one of the things you say early on in the book is that even if I can't necessarily nail down the right year, I can at least put you, as you said, in the ballpark. And that's helpful because, like you said, we are fortunate when we read the Bible that it has a general chronological feel, which is unlike, say, the Quran, which just has nothing to do with the chronology in terms of how it was written. But even so, at least it helps you understand what was taking place at the time and why some of these things are happening. And again, it also helps you understand that there are differences from the beginning or the birth of Israel, what happens during the United Monarchy or when the kingdoms were divided, when the Israelites were in exile, or of course then when you come even to the New Testament, the whole issue of Jesus Christ, and then of course the early church. So this is just a helpful way to get into God's Word. And because you've broken it down into 365 days, you can start at any time you want. But if you just read a piece each day, you will have a much better insight into what you're reading. So I would encourage people to read the verses on the top of the sheet for that day, then to read the commentary. And this, first of all, will keep you honest about reading through the Bible, because I'm a firm believer in having everybody read through the Bible once a year if they can do so. And that gives them an opportunity to not only read through the Bible, but to spend a few more minutes with you and look at and understand the significance of what they've just read.
Well, that's exactly right. And I also try to make this as devotional as I can, and I focus on the people, the main people. You really come away from the book understanding the big picture. And, very often people look at the Bible and they read about the people of the Bible in isolated fragments. And they don't understand the epic value of what's taking place in the whole Bible. But when you read it chronologically, one person after the other, who comes into contact with this person and that person, who gives birth to this other person, as you start to unfold the drama in that way, it does start to take on a lot more interest because you understand people in context and you understand events in context. It's kind of like leaving the Western mindset here in 2019 and going back to Bible times and walking through the whole drama in a rapid fashion. Obviously, we're doing it in a year, but still doing it that way just helps you to take yourself out of the Western mindset and to understand things as they unfolded back then.
Well, again, it is a resource that has been out for about a year, but I have never really had a chance to talk to you about that. So if you go to our website, pointofview.net, you can see that we have a link to the paperback edition of this or the Kindle edition, and either way would be just a great resource to put in your hands. It's published by our friends at Harvest House. Because it's been out for about a year, maybe you can find it in your local bookstore, but if you cannot, we've provided that opportunity for you to do so. And of course, as always, we do have a link to ronrhodes.org so that you can follow what he has at Reasoning from the Scriptures Ministries. But I thought when we come back, we would move from this very good book on the chronological tour through the Bible into questions of prophecy. And that's this book, Jesus and the End Times, which came out earlier this year. So we'll continue our conversation with Dr. Ron Rhodes right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
One of the most powerful critiques of public education came 9 years ago in the film Waiting for Superman. The documentary told the story of 5 students trying to get out of the rotten public school system and be accepted into schools that might give them a chance for success. It was powerful because people with liberal values were the ones who produced it. Now, George Packer is a staff writer at The Atlantic and would also describe himself as a liberal. That is why his latest article on When the Culture War Comes for the Kids is so powerful. He begins his article by describing the challenges of getting his young son into a private school. Then his prospects improve when he is informed that his son made it off the wait list for his preferred public school. If you don't want to read the 25 pages in his story, you might read the insightful summary by Matthew Continetti with the appropriate title, George Packer Gets Mugged by Reality. George Packer and his wife were excited to put their son in what he called a liberal white family's dream. At first, they were pleased with the school. Then, to use his words, things began to change. Leftist perspectives quickly changed the direction of the school. Rage and indignation about Trump and societal injustice became part of the curriculum. Parents opted their children out of standardized tests because they were deemed to be biased and racist. Boy and girl bathrooms were changed to gender-neutral bathrooms. Families split into warring factions. And I might mention that George Packer isn't really reporting anything that many of my radio guests haven't already been describing for decades, but they were conservative and thus easy to dismiss. He is a liberal and now sees how the left and the culture war are ruining education. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Anti-Semitism, go to viewpoints.info/antisemitism. Viewpoints.info/antisemitism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Once again, we're going to be talking with Dr. Ron Rhodes about Jesus and the End Times. It's a book that came out earlier this year, What He Said and What the Future Holds. It is also published by Harvest House. We have information about it on our website, but of course you probably would also be able to find it in your local bookstore. But if you can't find it there, we certainly want to focus some time and attention on this. And Ron Rhodes, you've written 70 books. And yet this is one of those ones where you say, yeah, this would have been a really good book to have written even years ago, because people say, well, everything you say about prophecy, well, those are written by Paul. I'm going, no, there were a lot of prophetic statements by Jesus, and sometimes we tend to read past them because we're looking for insights on how to live the Christian life or Sermon on the Mount or whatever. And yet Jesus was really giving quite a bit of prophetic teaching in the Gospels, wasn't he?
Well, he did, and I would say even broader than that. Jesus is the ultimate source of all prophecy, in my view. For example, we read about the Old Testament prophets. You know, all these different prophets in the Old Testament spoke about the end times. But in 1 Peter 1:11, we are told that the prophets spoke by the Spirit of Christ. It was the Spirit of Christ within them. Some people will say that that was Christ. Others say it was the Holy Spirit. Even if it was the Holy Spirit helps us to understand the words of Christ, according to John's Gospel. So either way, the source of those prophecies is Jesus. The book of Revelation, right there in chapter 1, verses 1 and 2, tells us that John's revelation came from Jesus Christ.
Right.
Likewise with the Apostle Paul. The Apostle Paul was the spokesperson of Jesus. And Jesus himself said that Paul is my chosen instrument to take my message to the Gentiles and to kings and the people of Israel. And so part of my message involves all the prophecies that the Apostle Paul wrote about. And so whether Jesus is speaking directly, like in the Olivet Discourse, or through Paul or through the Old Testament prophets or the revelation he gave to John, Jesus is the source. And I think that's one of those things that a lot of people tend to neglect.
Yeah, and I think you've done a very good job of explaining that Jesus spoke through the Old Testament prophets. He then, of course, had the prophetic teaching in the Gospels. And the one that people tend to miss all the time is the book of Revelation is a revelation from Jesus Christ. So we're going to be looking at all those different elements. And so, again, it's an excellent book that has 12 chapters. We'll do our best to try to cover a number of them. But the first one is one that would have been a surprise, I think, for some of our listeners, because I've had some people that said, some of you that believe in a rapture, well, that's just something that Paul wrote about. And yet here you have the first chapter talking about the fact that Jesus promises to rapture us. Where do we find that?
Well, we find that in John 14, verses 1 to 3, where Jesus says, "Don't let your hearts be troubled. Trust in God and trust also in me. There is more than enough room in my Father's house. If this were not so, would I have told you that I'm going to prepare a place for you? When everything is ready, I will come and get you, so that you will always be with me where I am." Now, some people, of course, will try to say, well, this must refer to the second coming. But Jesus says he's preparing a place for us, and when he comes to get us, he's going to take us back to that place that he's prepared. So, this is not what happens at the second coming. This is a reference, I believe, to the rapture of the church. And it's perfectly consistent with what you read about the rapture in Paul in 1 Thessalonians 4, verses 13 through 18, and in the book of Revelation, chapter 3, verse 10, and other passages.
And that's one of the things that I thought was very telling, because you do see a parallel that you have in the book. This is worth the book alone, before we even get past the first chapter, between John 14, verses 1 and 3, and then 1 Thessalonians 4, 13 to 18. So some people that say, well, that idea of rapture, that was created later on, or it was something that Paul came up with. No, you see just an incredible parallel between what Jesus says and what Paul says. And so that, I thought, was just a very significant insight in the first chapter of the book.
Well, in John 14, it says that, Jesus himself affirms, "I will come." Likewise, Paul in 1 Thessalonians 4 says that Christ will come down from heaven. In John 14, Jesus says to believers, "I will take you to myself." In 1 Thessalonians 4, it says that believers will be caught up to meet Christ in the air. In John 14, it says believers will be with him. Jesus says, "You will always be with me where I am." Whereas in 1 Thessalonians 4, it affirms that believers will be with the Lord forever. And then in John 14, Jesus says the purpose of this revelation about the rapture is so that their hearts would not be troubled. Likewise, in 1 Thessalonians 4, the purpose of the revelation about the rapture is to minimize grief and to bring about encouragement. And that encouragement is especially important because all of us have lost people to death.
Yes.
What about our Christian loved ones? And so, to me, it's not surprising that there are similarities of teaching between Jesus and Paul, because Jesus himself said that Paul was my chosen instrument who will speak my message.
Yes. So again, a lot of that's just in that first chapter, and in just a few minutes we'll get into, over the next hour probably, the whole idea of the parable of the fig tree and some of the other prophetic statements, as well as in the days of Noah. But let's get to this idea of the tribulation. You devote 2 chapters to this, and again, the word tribulation has different shades of meaning, but again, it's a time that the listeners to Point of View would not like to go through. And Jesus gives us a pretty good idea of what it indeed would be like, doesn't he?
Well, he does. And, of course, we all go through some aspect of tribulation while we're on the earth. There's general tribulation that all Christians go through, but there's also a specific period of tribulation that will last 7 years prior to the second coming of Christ. And, Jesus talks a lot about this in different places. When you read through Matthew 24, for example, we read the Olivet Discourse. Right. And Jesus talks about nations rising up against nations and wars and rumors of wars. He talks about the abomination of desolation when the Jewish temple becomes desolate. He warns about the rise of false Christs and false apostles and teachers. And all of this parallels perfectly what we read about the seal judgments in the book of Revelation, chapter 6 and following. And again, that's what you would expect, since the revelation that went to John ultimately came from Jesus. Now, you're right. The listeners of your broadcast don't want to be here. It's going to be a period that Scripture says will be characterized by wrath, judgment, indignation, trial, trouble, destruction, darkness, desolation, overturning, and punishment. Now, Kerby, allow me to clarify something. I personally believe that the rapture is going to happen before this time, but I've heard some people say that the only reason we believe in that is because we don't want to go through that period, or that we're afraid to go through the period. That's really not true. I mean, nobody wants to go through that period, but pre-tribulationists are pre-trib because they believe in the Bible. And so let's just establish that, being a biblicist is much more important than whatever particular theological persuasion you hold to, whether it's pre-trib or post-trib. We should all strive to be biblicists first and foremost. And that includes dealing with the tribulation period.
One other thing about the tribulation before we take a break is this idea of deception. And you spend a fair amount of time talking about that as well, because that seems, is it fair to say, really almost unprecedented? That's a different kind of, we have a lot of deception today, but you do believe that that may be something that is certainly things that we've never really seen before.
Well, the thing is that following the rapture of the church, you're no longer going to have the Spirit of truth working on the earth through the church. That's the Holy Spirit working through the church. And if all Christians are removed, there's no one there to defend the truth. God will certainly raise up 2 prophetic witnesses and 144,000 Jewish witnesses to speak the truth. But when the rapture of the church takes place, that kind of greases the skids for the rapid escalation of apostasy. And, that's going to make it easier for people to fall for the lies of the Antichrist and the false prophet who sets forth a false religion.
Wow. Let's take a break, and when we come back, we'll continue our conversation for a few more minutes. And if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. But I wanted to cover some of this because I thought this book would be very helpful to you. It came out a couple of months ago, so it's already probably available in your bookstore if you would like to find it there. And if you can't, of course, we have a link to that so that you can get it in either a paperback or in Kindle. And we also have a link to ronrhodes.org. His organization is called Reasoning from the Scriptures Ministries. And so you've got some great material there about his different books and videos and all sorts of other articles that I think you would find very helpful. And if you have a question, I can't think of anybody I know who does a better job in answering each individual question that he receives. Now, of course, if we do a program like this, he gets a lot of questions at once, so don't expect instantaneous response, but he has always been so dedicated to answer everybody's question, and so that's something else that you can find as you go to his website, ronrhodes.org, Reasoning from Scriptures Ministries. We'll continue our conversation right after this.
When you gift a point of view, does it make a difference? Jeremy Dies would tell you that it does. He grew up listening to Point of View in the back seat of his mom's car, and it helped to shape his thinking.
I had parents that were able to sit across from me at the dinner table after we listened to Marlon Maddox and Kerby Anderson years ago and think through what the scriptures say about these issues of current significance in our lives. That's only possible because Point of View has come along and ministered into my life and made me who I am today. And here I am today defending religious liberty, partly because Marlon Maddox and Penn Dexter and Kerby Anderson were the ones that were pushing me towards all that. They taught me how to think through these issues. They didn't tell me what to think. They taught me how to think.
Each gift you give will change lives. Not every Point of View listener will become a Jeremy, but if they listen for very long, they will be changed. And that will change how they impact and affect the lives of the people around them. So make that decision to change a life today. Join the Truth Team and boldly stand for truth in a world of lies, distortion, and information manipulation. Go to pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. That's 1-800-347-5151.
Point of View will continue after this.
are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Continue conversation today with Dr. Ron Rhodes as we continue talking about his book, Jesus and the End Times. And one of the things you talk about is the parable of the fig tree. Now, it is interesting how many times fig trees and figs were used in some kind of teaching, but Jesus, especially in Matthew 24, spends some time talking about learn a lesson from the fig tree. Explain that if you might.
Well, it's a very important lesson. He talks about the fact that when the fig tree's branches bud and its leaves begin to sprout, you know that summer is near. In the same way, when you see all these things, that is to say the signs of the times that were just mentioned,
right,
you can know that his return is very near, right at the door. And that's a very important statement because it indicates that there's going to be a correlation between the prophecies in the Bible, including Jesus' prophecies, and what transpires in the world. I make that point, Kerby, because sometimes I'm criticized for saying that we should be observers of the world to see if there's any correlations between what's going on in the world and what the biblical prophets spoke about. Very clearly, for this generation that's going to live during the tribulation period, they're going to witness certain things take place, like the rise of nation against nation and the rise of false prophets and false Christs and the abomination of desolation. They're going to see these things start to happen. And Jesus is indicating, listen, when you see this stuff start to happen, mark my words, everything is coming to an end quickly. And I think that he said that because he wants to encourage those believers who happen to be alive during the tribulation period. Now, that might surprise some people to hear that there will be Christians there, and there will be. I believe that Christians will be raptured before that period, but there will be new believers who become believers as a result of the ministry of the two great prophets of Revelation 11, as well as the 144,000 Jewish witnesses who proclaim the gospel of the kingdom all over the world. And so that's why Revelation 7 speaks of a great multitude of believers. And all that happens in the tribulation period. And so in order to encourage them in the midst of all this stuff going wrong, Jesus tells them, when you see this stuff start to happen, really start to build up your faith because you know that everything's about to come to an end and that you're going to be with me forever.
And again, then the counter to that is in chapter 5, where you see, of course, like the days of Noah, because he points out that no one knows the day or the hour when these things will happen, but at the same time, it will be like in the days of Noah. So you use that to say that even though we should pay attention to the signs, we should avoid date setting, and you go through some pretty sad examples of failed predictions, and I appreciate the fact you put that in there because every time you talk about prophecy, we all know how people then point to these failed predictions that were made that aren't based upon any kind of biblical understanding, but just simply because they want to attract attention to their particular prophetic ideas.
Well, that's right. And I think it's important to understand that when Jesus talked about the fig tree, that's a tribulation context very specifically. We're not in the tribulation yet. That's a tribulation context where Jesus is talking about the fig tree and when you see this stuff start to happen. Now, Jesus did say that we could not know the day or the hour, but the prophecies, I think, are indicated to give us an idea that we're in the season of the Lord's return.
Right.
We cannot set dates, and we're not supposed to set dates, and I do give some bad examples. And to tell you the truth, I hate it when Christians set, dates for the rapture or for whatever else, because guess what? 5 months later, you start to read articles about this in atheist and humanistic magazines. Those guys love to talk about silly Christians who are setting dates. So I say, why give the enemies of Christianity ammo? And that's aside from the fact that Jesus himself told us that we cannot know the day or the hour.
Well, very good. Let's get into some of these other parables. I mean, there are just quite a number, and you begin to realize that when you start turning the pages in your book, because you have the parable of the great feast, a parable of the wheat and the weeds, or the wheat and the tares, depending on how you say it, the parable of growing seed, of the mustard seed, of yeast. These are all important parables, and each one of them help us understand a little bit more about the kingdom of heaven, don't they?
Well, they really do. And obviously, we don't have the time to go through all of them, but, just consider what Jesus is doing here. He's using word pictures, and by using word pictures, he helps people to understand stuff that they could not understand before. Just to give you an example, he talks about the parable of the fishing net, and he talks about how the kingdom of heaven is kind of like a fishing net thrown into the water and catches fish of every kind. And there's good fish and there's bad fish. There's good people and there's wicked people. And that would seem to indicate that in this age in which we live, there will be both genuine believers and phony professing Christians that coexist within the kingdom. And it's only at the end of the age that there will be a separation of the righteous from the unrighteous. If you can picture in your mind, Kirby, a fisherman pulling a net up out of the water and putting all those fish on the floor of his boat, he picks up some of them and throws them back into the water because they're no good. Whereas he keeps the good ones. Well, this is a word picture to help us to understand that there's going to be a separation at the end, where the good are going to be separated from the wicked. There are professing Christians even today who will go to church, but they have no relationship with Jesus Christ. They have no interest in reading the Bible. They have no interest in obedience to the Lord. They're Christian in name only. And so, that's food for thought. I tell you what, that's relevant stuff for us to be aware of, because I'm pretty sure that nobody listening to my voice wants to be counted among those to whom Christ says, "Depart from me, because I never knew you."
Wow.
That's something for us to think about, because a lot of people are assuming they're Christians, but what if you're not really a Christian? What if you're just a church attender? Have you really read the Bible and understood what a Christian actually is? And so, that's one of the applications of that particular parable, and there's a bunch more that we could look at, but I know that time forbids.
Yes, but again, just to underscore that just a minute, certainly I don't want any of our listeners to say, I go to church, so we're good, God grades on the curve, and I'm better than a lot of people I know, so that's all fine. And no, that's not exactly what the gospel is, and we certainly have spent time trying to talk about that, and even before the end of this program, I hope we can maybe once again make sure that you are certain that you are saved and you are headed to heaven. And one of the things I think is very powerful in this piece that you have here is you recognize that the parables address different issues. I mentioned just a minute ago, some of the parables are about the kingdom of heaven. We just a minute ago talked about the parable of the fig tree, which really relates to the tribulation. And then things like the parable of the talents or the parable of the 10 servants, that really relates in the future to the millennial kingdom. So this is helpful too, because even as people read these parables, they need to figure out where it fits, back to our word chronology, where it fits in terms of kind of the end times chronology. True?
Well, that's exactly right. And you have to understand the audience. Jesus was talking to a first century Jewish audience, and he was speaking their language. He was using terms that they were familiar with. And that's really the best method of teaching. And even today, those who are experts in what's called pedagogy, the study of how to teach, will point out that we think in terms of analogies. And so Jesus is using analogies based upon something that the people were already familiar with, and using that to treat them something about either the tribulation period or the kingdom that follows. And in the parable of the great feast, it would seem that Jesus was teaching that the king and his kingdom have been offered to the nation of Israel, but the Jews were indifferent to the offer. The Jews even murdered the deliverers of the message, that is to say, the prophets. And so now the invitation has been broadened to include everyone, including the Gentiles. And so the kingdom is going to be made up of saved Gentiles and saved Jewish people. And, after you read through this stuff and understand it in context, it really does make a lot of sense.
And again, this is a book that goes through some of those parables and then talks about the second coming of Jesus Christ, what we just mentioned a little bit in passing, the judgment of the nations in the millennial kingdom, then the eternal state, and even the lessons learned from the 7 churches. And so when we come back, we've obviously skipped over some aspects of the millennial kingdom, but many of you might say, okay, I really forget that Jesus is actually in the book of Revelation. Of course, that's the title of it, but nevertheless, that's a part that I think would be helpful. And so as we come back from the break, I'd like to talk about some of the lessons we can learn from these 7 churches in the book of Revelation, because that's kind of the end part of all of that. And then just, of course, this book helps you understand why you can trust biblical prophecy, what it means in terms of being prepared, and also what it does in terms of creating a real sense of urgency to go out and to preach the gospel. So all of it found in this book, Jesus and the End Times, what he said and what the future holds. And it takes you through the different ways in which Jesus addresses this in the Gospels. But when we come back, I want to talk about what does Jesus say in the book of Revelation. We have a lot more to cover, and we will do so right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes, Ron Rhodes with us as we talk about his book, Jesus and the End Times. And we really are skipping over some very significant chapters, but in the interest of time, I thought it might be worthwhile to focus on lessons learned from the 7 churches. Now, again, 7 churches, we may not have a time to look at all 7, but I thought, Ron, this would be helpful because in some respects, it brings us back to the so what question, because here Jesus addresses these churches in the early chapters 2 and 3 of the book of Revelation. And in some respects, the churches that you see there in Asia Minor maybe represent even the churches we have today here in the 21st century. So what are some of the things that Jesus actually shares with them?
Well, that's a great question because we do learn from what he said to them. Jesus would typically affirm what the church was doing right, and then he would tell them what they were doing wrong. And in one case, with the church in Ephesus, Jesus told them that they did do some things good. They didn't tolerate evil people, nor did they tolerate phony apostles. But Christ also had words of correction for them and told them that they needed to turn back to him. You know, they don't love me. They don't love each other. They don't love others the way that they should and the way that they did at first. And so what I learned from that is simply this. Doctrinal accuracy and moral purity are very important, but these are not enough. Supreme love for God and others is also necessary. Christianity is more than just being doctrinally correct. It involves an ongoing love relationship with the Lord. And I think that was the burning issue that the Lord was dealing with the church of Ephesus. Now, that's relevant to us, isn't it?
Oh, it certainly is.
You know, we have a lot of formalism in churches today. We go through the motions. We go to Bible studies, and those things are all good. But do you have that kind of a burning love that Jesus is talking about? Or do you have a Christianity that's more about just being doctrinally correct? Now, you're hearing an apologist say that, Kerby.
Yes.
You know, I place a high premium on teaching the truth. But the fact is that Christianity is more than the truth. It's more than holding to the truth. There's also that loving, personal relationship with the Lord.
And so, again, each one of these churches that we talk about are providing, if you will, an opportunity to see what they did correctly and then to actually receive words of admonition and even exhortation to do the right things. And some of them are pretty much getting relatively good passing marks. Some of them are really being very criticized, I guess you should say. Laodicea certainly comes to mind, and others that are certainly not that way. So where would we learn maybe some other the lessons that are very important for us here in the 21st century?
Well, the fact is that we learn from each one of these. You know, the Laodiceans, of course, they were very wealthy and commercially successful. And, you know, there's nothing wrong with being commercially successful, but that's not enough, is it? You know, what does Scripture have to say? Christ himself said, I would rather that you were neither cold or hot. I would rather that you would be cold or hot, not in between. You see, these were lukewarm believers. And there's nothing more than being lukewarm. And I think this kind of goes along with what I was saying before. A lot of Christians kind of go through the motions of formality, they do their regular spirituality and church attending and all like that. But the question is, are you hot on fire for the Lord, or are you characterized more by being lukewarm? You know, Jesus says that he doesn't like lukewarm, and he's going to spit the lukewarm out of his mouth. That's kind of a horrific word picture when you think about it.
Yes.
But, you know, we learn from this kind of stuff. You know, these guys are so important for us, Kerby, for one reason, and that is that when we think about Jesus, we always think about him being love incarnate, and he is love incarnate. There's no more loving person on earth that ever existed than Jesus. But you know what? Jesus is talking to people who are in churches and Christians, and he speaks pretty strict words to them about getting the stuff that's wrong right. And so even though Christ is a lover of people and a lover of Christians, Jesus himself is also a lover of truth, and he will take disciplinary measures if Christians choose not to respond. Now, of course, he does it in love. He does that discipline in order to restore believers and bring them back into a right relationship with God. But nevertheless, sometimes that discipline can hurt. And that's what Jesus, I think, is talking about in these 7 churches.
Very good. Just before I let you go, let me mention that you have a postscript there. You can trust biblical prophecy, and I appreciate you putting that in there because, after all, you are an apologist, and you quote, of course, yourself and Norm Geisler and others to point out that there have been some people that have said, well, what look like prophecies actually in the Old Testament were written closer to the time of Christ. And so these messianic prophecies were Christian inventions. First of all, that doesn't work at all because we have, Dead Sea Scrolls and a lot of things to show that's not the case. And then the idea that, well, Jesus really wasn't making prophetic statements. Well, of course he is. And so I appreciate you putting that in there because you know as well as I do that a young person going off to college or even getting out on the internet and seeing some of these websites will hear people arguing that these really aren't prophecies, but they really are. And to me, one of the greatest evidences of God's fingerprints on the scriptures is the amount of Old Testament prophecy already fulfilled, the prophecies fulfilled in the person of Jesus Christ, the Messiah. And that gives us confidence that these prophecies that have not been fulfilled will be fulfilled in the future.
That's right. In fact, that's the guiding rule that I've always used in writing all my prophecy books. And I've also held that when the plain sense makes good sense, seek no other sense lest you end up in nonsense. And that's just based upon a literal understanding of Scripture. That's why we can say that if you want to understand how God is going to fulfill prophecy in the future, take a look at how he has fulfilled prophecy in the past, because God is consistent. God doesn't change his methods halfway through. He has been perfectly consistent in fulfilling those prophecies literally. Like Jesus being born of a virgin, Isaiah 7:14, being pierced for our sins, Zechariah 12:10, being born in Bethlehem, Micah 5:2. All those are literal. And in the same way, all the second coming prophecies and all the events that lead up to the second coming, those prophecies will be fulfilled just as literally.
Again, the book is entitled Jesus and the End Times, written by Dr. Ron Rhodes. We also have a link to ronrhodes.org and Reasoning from the Scriptures Ministries. And you've got a great picture there where you're standing next to Bob Hawkins, who I've known at president of Harvest House Publishers, over 1 million books sold. And again, that's a great award that you received. And again, one of the reasons why we commend your books to individuals, they have had such an incredible impact on the body of Christ, and it's always great to have you on the program. So I look forward to the next opportunity, and thank you today for giving us a chance to not only know about this chronological tour through the Bible, but also this book that came out this year, Jesus and the End Times. So, Ron, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Thank you, Kerby. It's always a pleasure, and there's nothing I'd rather talk about than the Bible.
Well, again, we encourage you to find out more about Ron Rhodes. We have a link to him on the website. If you'd like to listen to it again, of course, you can download the podcast or watch it on YouTube. And that is all we have for today. Let me mention that tomorrow, what are we going to do? Well, first of all, we're going to spend some time on our weekend edition kind of looking at some of the issues in the news. One of the callers yesterday said, well, we need to talk about China. We're going to do so and really give you a little bit of an understanding on where are we in terms of this trade war with China. What about the military aggression of China? What about 70 years of communist rule in China? What about the one-child policy? So we're going to talk about that. Of course, we'll give you an update on the impeachment inquiry, and we'll look at Campaign 2020 and a number of other topics that are in the news. So we've got a lot to cover tomorrow, and we will do that here on Point of View. If you find yourself saying, I'd like to know a little bit more about some of the things you've covered today, some of the articles and some of the resources, they're all available at our website, pointofview.net. And as you go there, I hope you'll also click on that button that says Truth Team. Join the Truth Team. Help us financially. We greatly would appreciate that. I want to thank Andrew and Steve for their help. See you back here tomorrow on Point of View.
There's an old saying that the first casualty in war is truth. Maybe that helps you understand what's happening in America right now. Thankfully, it's not a war with bullets, but there is a war for control. Control of the country and control of your pocketbook. Truth is under fire, but you can help turn the tide by supporting truth. Join the Truth Team at Point of View Radio. Learn how you can make a difference at pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. Don't let truth become a casualty on your watch. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151.
So what would you do with an extra $500 a month in your budget? Pay off loans, save it, do something fun? Well, it's something you may need to think about if you become a member of MediShare MediShare is a Christian healthcare sharing ministry, and it works. You can save big time on your healthcare costs, and you don't have to pay for things you don't believe in either. Find out more. Call 855-SHARE-40. That's 855-SHARE-40. 855-SHARE-40.
Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.